So what's going on, everybody? I figured I'd do a video on this again because the last one that I didn't come out so well in my opinion. The audio was all over the place and I feel like I could have done a much better job at explaining to you why the exposure triangle is important. But this is why I am redoing it again, and now here for part 2. When you're trying to shoot in manual mode, you'll see that there's a couple of settings in your camera that you're going to control. Today I'm talking about 3 of them: the shutter speed, the ISO, and the aperture. These are the 3 components that build up the exposure triangle. Now, how do these play into action? Well, that's what I'm here to talk about today. The camera. So we're taking today our camera. In this case, for me, it's my personal T5i camera, and each camera has their own sensor. So behind this mirror you see here, there's a sensor behind it, and so that sensor is what essentially captures your image when exposed to light. So when you're manipulating the numbers inside your camera to change, for example, the ISO, you're changing how much exposure goes into that sensor. So let's take, for instance, this photograph right here. So as you can see, is not too overexposed and not too underexposed. It's kind of like right in the middle. So the ISO I use for this image is 100. Now what does this mean? Let's say that the ISO is kind of like the level and how much light goes into that sensor that I mentioned earlier. And as you can see, with 100, it's takes it in perfectly fine. That's also taken into consideration my aperture and shutter, but I don't want to focus on that right now. I just want to focus on the effects that happen when you're changing this number. What do I mean? So if we look at this other image here, I shot it at 1600. Same settings, it's just that I changed the ISO. And here, as you can see, it's at 1600. And what's going on here is that the camera is now, or should I say the sensor, is now taking in more light into its frame. And so now you end up with an image that like this that becomes overexposed and very difficult to see the detail of the structure here. And lastly, in order to, I guess, exaggerate in this example, I ended up using 12,800 ISO, which is the highest ISO setting that my camera goes up to. And here, as you can see, it's super overexposed, and yeah, this is kind of like the example that I wanted to bring up. So now, as you can see, the ISO changes the sensitivity on the sensor inside the camera in terms of exposure. So remember, the lower the number and the ISO is, the less light goes into the sensor. The higher the number, the ISO, the more light goes into the sensor. To keep it simple. To keep it simple. So now, what is aperture? Well, aperture just controls how wide or how narrow the lens opens up whenever you take a picture. And in result, you're also, again, controlling how much light comes in. But not only that, you're also controlling the depth of field. Now, the depth of field is pretty much the range in which things are in focus. So what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at this image and see how aperture affects the distance in which things are in focus. So here we have a lion, which is something I wanted to emphasize on, that I shot at 3.5. And as you can see, my lion is in focus, things are sharp, meanwhile the background is out of focus. Meaning that when I have my aperture set at 3.5, the depth of field is pretty narrow, right? There's a limited range in which things are going to be in focus. And again, that means that my lens is also wider. So now more light's coming in. Keep that in mind. Here I shot another image of the line again, but this time I shot it at f14, meaning that the lens is now narrower, and so therefore light is not coming in as much, which is why we're getting this dark effect. But as you can see, it's very subtle. The background is also becoming in focus. This is because we have increased the depth of field. Now, one last image is the f/22 shot. Here, as you can see, and again, I didn't change any settings. I just changed the aperture just to show you guys how this works. It's a lot darker. The lens is a lot more narrow. It's tight. f/22 is pretty small, but you can see majority of the things in this picture is in focus. And this usually helps me out whenever I'm trying to shoot, group shots where you have people lined up towards the back. Although f/22, it's a lot more narrow for the lens, so not a lot of lights coming in, but yet you're having a pretty good distance of what things are going to be in focus. So I hope this helps you as an example to help you guys understand how aperture affects your images when you're shooting in manual mode. The shutter speed is pretty much how fast the image is taken. So again, if we go back to our camera here, so here, let me give you guys a visual on how shutter speed works. So when I take a picture, you guys saw how fast that mirror went? That mirror is the shutter speed taking action. So when I take a photograph, you can control the speed and how fast things are taken. So usually things are shot within a fractions of a second, and so when you're taking the photograph, the shutter speed can have many different kinds of effects. It can make your image blurry, can make your image really sharp and crisp. So let's look at some examples to show you guys what I mean. So for instance, here I was at the park taking pictures of people playing basketball. I know basketball is a pretty intensive sport. Things are moving around a lot. So here I shot it at 160th of a second. And so here now, you can see when they shot the ball up into the net's fine. It's completely sharp. It's in focus. So is the basketball. And so when you shoot at that kind of speed, you're also keep in mind not letting as much light come in as well. And so you have to adjust your manual settings accordingly to allow more light in. On the next example, I shot an image here at 1/30th of a second. Although 1/30th of a second is quick, sometimes it's not quick enough to capture movements in real life. So here we can start seeing some blurriness in the image. We could say, like the kid's legs, it's blurry. People in the background are becoming blurry. Things are just becoming very hard to look at. But again, it all depends on what kind of shot you're going for. But this is just an example as to what happens when you shoot a little slower. On the last example, I shot, I believe, a second on this one. Yeah, a complete second. So that's the cool thing about cameras. Like, you could shoot in fractions of a second, but you can also shoot in seconds, and that has an effect to where now you're just capturing lines and blurriness. And I think it's a pretty cool effect, again, depending on what kind of mood you're going for in your picture. But for this instance, doesn't say much. It's just very blurry. And of course, because the is shooting at a second, the frame, remember that mirror, the mirror opens up and exposes the frame, the sensor, sorry, for a second. And that's a lot of time for the sensor to be gathering information. One tip I would like to give you in terms of shutter speed is that the more it's exposed on, the longer it's exposed for, the more light comes in. The less light it's exposed for like fractions of a second, the less light comes in. So again, it's all about controlling light when it comes to the exposure triangle. And depending on what setting you manipulate, it's going to take an effect on your image. Alright? And that's what I wanted to go over with you. And so that's pretty much it. That's the exposure triangle. You know, it's all a matter of just experimenting as you go along. You know, for if you're a beginner and you really want to get into this stuff, I would recommend start taking pictures of things that don't move, because they are, you know, you can test out your settings a lot more without having to worry about things changing or things moving. You know, keep it simple. And when you go around taking pictures of objects and stuff, look around and see how, you know, your ISO, your shutter speed, your aperture, you know, changes your image and the look and feel. And also keep in mind what you're going for as well. You know, if you want a certain object to be in focus, you know, change your settings towards that. If you want a lot of things in focus, now you know how to do so. So again, thank you so much for watching this video. I want to appreciate for your time to, you know, sitting down with me and looking over some pictures. And I hope you took something out of it today. Yeah, that's all I got. Oh, one thing before I forget. Let's look at this, our camera settings, right? So over here is the shutter speed, here is the aperture, and here is the ISO. That's if you have a Canon camera. If you have a Nikon camera, I'll try to look for an image online to see if I can find their menu. Again, I appreciate your time and I want to thank you so much. If you know, if you can click on that like button, please, I would really appreciate it, and kind of just let me know that my information was helpful to you. And that's it. I don't know what else to say. The more you develop an eye for things, we'll start getting more into deeper topics about that. But for now, I am Captain Giorgio. Have a nice day.